This is the lesson on the church. If you make this your work, you'll need some help carrying it to your spot. And be careful of the towers, because they might fall down. This is the table for Holy Communion. Sometimes it's called an altar, and sometimes it's called a table. I wonder where it goes in the church. I wonder where it is in our church. There are many different kinds of churches. Sometimes they look like this, and sometimes they are different. Sometimes when people see a church like this, they think it's how churches are supposed to look. But really, this is just one shape in a long story of holy spaces. There was a time when churches did not have towers. The roof of a church like this was high and long. Here are the tall openings for the windows. You see the round windows on either end. A church with high walls like this needed these supports to hold up the walls. Let's take this away. Now watch. Now we have a church with solid walls and tiny windows. And a church like this was also filled with pillars to hold up the heavy stone roof. Now, when you were inside and you looked up, the ceiling was flat. I wonder how that felt. Churches were not always in the shape of a cross either. Sometimes they looked like this. You have to kind of pretend that this is a wall, a closed wall, that they were long and straight like this with a curved end, called basilicas. And the bishop would sit up here in the round part to teach and share the bread and the wine. They didn't always look like this either. Sometimes they were round. Like this. And the holy table or the table for Holy Communion would be placed in the middle so people could gather around it. I wonder what there was before there were round churches. Well, in the early days, people would gather in their homes. They would gather where they could, mostly in secret. Sometimes in their homes or on a hillside or even underneath the ground in the catacombs of Rome. And then there was nothing. In the year 70 CE, the Romans destroyed the temple and the whole city of Jerusalem. It was awful. Most of the people that lived in the city were killed, and the city was burned. You can still find the broken stones and some of the burnt out doorways in the city from those terrible days. What were they going to do? There was no temple, no priests, no plan to guide their worship. There was nothing but a scary silence and broken stones. The temple and the tabernacle before were like boxes inside of boxes, as a parable is inside a parable inside a parable. What would the new shape be? The Jews and the Jewish Christians had worshipped in the temple. Where would they go now? The Romans were after both the Jews and the Christians. They were angry because the Jews and the Jewish Christians would not bow down and worship the Roman gods. They mostly met in secret in their homes. The Jewish people would keep the Passover and the Sabbath in their homes, and then they built synagogues. And the Christians gathered in homes too, to share the bread and the wine and tell their stories. Then the emperor, the Roman Emperor Constantine, finally made it a law that it was okay to be Christian. Now the Christians could worship together without fear. They read the stories of Jesus and the letters of Paul, the Psalms, and all the things from their Jewish days that they knew so well. They also collected money and food for the poor. And when there were baptisms, they would go out to the river, just as Jesus did when he was baptized by his cousin John. Sometimes people left home to worship. They made pilgrimages to holy places where holy things had happened, or maybe a holy person was buried, like one of the martyrs who died for being Christian. And sometimes they would build shrines in those places, little churches, so people could gather around what was important there. They would place the table for Holy Communion in the center. The Emperor Constantine gave the Christians the law buildings to worship in. They are called basilicas. They were long and straight like a road. The bishop would sit in the curved part to teach and share the bread and the wine. Now, there were priests. They would read the scriptures. They would lead the prayers and preach and share the bread and the wine with people when the bishop was not there. The people would sit and stand, and when it was time for Holy Communion, they would make a little pilgrimage up to the front to receive the bread and the wine. Just like people make big pilgrimages to the city of Jerusalem. When they could build their own churches, they often built them in the shape of a cross, with thick walls and a heavy roof. They wanted to feel safe. These churches were like a fortress. And here, where the short part and the long part meet, is what is called the crossing. People worshipped in churches like this for hundreds of years. But then, they wanted to build the walls higher, to show that God was even bigger than the sky. They built a lofty cross, so the bigness of God could be inside. The walls were so high that they needed these supports to hold them up. They made tall windows filled with colored glass and shapes, each with its own story. The people still made little pilgrimages up to the front to receive the bread and the wine. But then 1,500 years later, in some places, the elders began to bring the bread and the wine to the people. In Geneva, where John Calvin was a leader, they not only put the table at the crossing, but also the place for preaching, and even his chair, which you can still find there today. Then they added these towers, so that as the people entered the church, they would look up and be reminded that God was bigger than any building. I wonder what part of this you liked the best. I wonder what part is most important. I wonder where you are in the story, or what part of the story feels like you do in church. I wonder if we could leave any of the story out and still have all that we need. I wonder what it takes to have a church. I wonder what you will make your work today.